Hello and welcome to the second lecture in the Glaucoma lecture series, sponsored by Meditred, an online website dedicated to medical education and training. Today's lecture is going to be on aqueous humor and outflow pathway. And this is Dr. Ramesh Ayala from Tulane School of Medicine, New Orleans, Louisiana, USA. Here are my financial disclosures, the most important being I'm part owner of the Meditred website. Let's talk about the relevant anatomy from the glaucoma and the aqueous humor point of view. Let's see if I can take some aids here, a pointer, which I love, and I like to draw, so we'll take a pencil. Alrighty. This is the site of interest for us from the glaucoma point of view. You have the ciliary body, which is the site of production of the aqueous humor, and you have the trabecular meshwork and the Schlem's canal complex, which is the site of outflow pathway for the aqueous humor. Between these two, you have the production of the aqueous and the outflow of the aqueous. And of course, what you don't see in this slide here is the pupil through which the aqueous that's made in the posterior chamber is flowing into the anterior chamber. And from there, it gets out to the trabecular meshwork and the Schlem's canal. Now let's talk briefly about the angle itself so you understand where we're going. But let me situate you in terms of the relevant anatomy. Here is sclera, here is cornea. The junction between the two is what we call as limbus. The one posterior closer to the sclera is the scleral-limbal junction right here. And then the one anterior to the cornea, closer to the cornea, is the corneal-limbal junction. Underneath these two junctions is where you will find the trabecular meshwork and the Schlem's canal. Important landmarks for the surgeon to know as we talk about this when we talk about the canal-based surgical procedures in the future. Now, posteriorly, you will see the ciliary body. Ciliary body, briefly, is like a triangle in cut section, which is what you're seeing here. The face, the anterior face of the ciliary body is what you see in the angle. And the one leg of this triangle is underneath the sclera, separated from the sclera by the supraciliary space. And then the inner section is divided into pars plana, the posterior pars plana, and the anteriorly located pars plicata. Now, our concentration from the glaucoma and aqueous humor production point of view is on pars plicata. Pars plicata has 70 to 80 finger-like projections that drop into the posterior chamber, and each one of these projections is called the ciliary process. The ciliary process is the site of the aqueous humor production. From there, the aqueous travels through the pupil into the anterior chamber, and from the anterior chamber, it exits out of the eye through the trabecular meshwork and the Schlem's canal. Let's look at the angle structure itself, the trabecular meshwork itself. We'll talk about the ciliary body and the ciliary processes itself a little later in the lecture. Let's concentrate on the outflow pathway first. So here is the trabecular meshwork. It's made listed as 1, 2, and 3. So the outermost one is the Schlem's canal. Next to the Schlem's canal, you have the juxtacanalicular area portion of the trabecular meshwork, which is right around here. And then you have the corneoscleral portion of the trabecular meshwork, and then you have the uveoscleral portion of the uveal portion of the trabecular meshwork. So what I want you to understand is this. Number 3, the uveal portion is the one that's facing the anterior chamber. So the anterior chamber is right here. Okay, so this is the anterior chamber. So the aqueous first faces the uveal portion of the trabecular meshwork. This uveal portion of the trabecular meshwork is made up of bands, what we call as a trabeculum, Each trabeculum is like a cylinder in the uveal portion, and it measures approximately 4 microns. It's made of collagen lined with endothelium, single layer of endothelium, and the pore size in the uveal portion is approximately, when you talk about the pores, here is the pore. Pore size is approximately 70 microns, 70 to 75 microns. So this trabecular meshwork, the uveal portion of the trabecular meshwork will lead to the inner uveal, the corneoscleral portion of the trabecular meshwork. Now the trabeculum shape changes a little bit in this in the corneoscleral section. It's less of a cylinder, more of a flat band, and the size of the pores also is smaller. It measures anywhere from 30 to 20 microns. Now also understand that these holes are not lying one on top of the other, meaning that it's not a continuous pathway for the aqueous. It's more of a filter of disproportionate size of different layers laid one on top of the others, where the wall could be impinging or overlying the whole of the underlying filter mechanism. So you will have the aqueous is flowing through this hole here, comes out through here, and then goes out through the pore here, and so on and so forth, all the way into the Schlem's canal. And the innermost layer is called the juxtacanalicular area, which is that junction with complex, the outermost portion of the corneal scleral trabecular meshwork and the inner wall of the Schlem's canal put together make this junction. This junction is important because this is it's made up of a complex structure of extracellular matrix, like we will look at the electron microscopy pictures a little later in the lecture, and vacuoles, and the aqueous escapes into this space, and from there is transported into the Schlem's canal. And this area is of importance for us in glaucoma, as it's believed that the major site of resistance to the outflow pathway lies in this juxtacanalicular portion of the of the trabecular meshwork. So you have you have the anterior chamber here, and you have the uveal portion of the trabecular meshwork with large pores, and the inner, the outer corneoscleral portion with the smaller pores, and then the outermost, the juxtacanalicular area that opens up, that drains the aqueous into the Schlem's canal. So this is what you'll see when you do gonioscopy, and if you're looking into the eye at the angle, and this is exactly what you're going to see, and it's important that you understand these landmarks as you examine patients with glaucoma to understand the pathophysiology of glaucoma. And also it's important for you to know these landmarks from not only the clinical diagnostic point of view, but also to understand how to do some of the newer canal procedures, such as the eye stent implantation or trabectome, etc. So the whole angle itself measures approximately 1,000 micrometers. The insertion microns, the insertion site of the iris on the ciliary body is approximately 1.5 millimeters from the limbus, or 1.5 millimeters from the Schwalbe's line as viewed internally. So if you look at the insertion of the iris on the ciliary body, there's the root of the iris. It's approximately 1.5 millimeters from the limbus, okay, or it's 1.5 millimeters from the Schwalbe's line. Both ways, it's about equidistant roughly. So here is the slate gray color is the ciliary body, and we'll talk more about this. And on top of that is the white band, the scleral spar. On top of that, you will see the pigmented trabecular meshwork, and the last structure that you're going to see, the most anterior, is the Schwalbe's line, which demarcates the end of the angle and the beginning of the cornea. Now let's talk about each one of these structures as viewed through gonioscopy. There will be a separate lecture on gonioscopy, but I want you to understand the relevant anatomy before you look at listen to the gonioscopy lecture itself. So what is the ciliary body? This is the portion that's visible in the angle is the anterior face of the ciliary body. Okay, here following the disinsertion of the iris root, you can see the face of the ciliary body clearly visible. Okay, and it's that portion of the ciliary body that is visible in the anterior chamber as a result of the insertion into the ciliary body, located anterior to the root of the iris. So the root of the iris is right here, and anterior to that is where the ciliary body is located. Appears gray or brown on exam. The width of the ciliary body is variable. It's widest in white population and more narrow in blacks and African in Asian population. So the ciliary body itself is made of three muscles: the longitudinal muscle fibers, the oblique, and the circular muscle fibers. The circular muscle fibers control accommodation. The longitudinal muscle fibers, which is, these muscles are located in this area. So the longitudinal muscle fibers are inserted into the scleral spur. In contraction on the anteriorly and posteriorly, these longitudinal muscle fibers were inserted into the ora serrata of the retina. So this longitudinal muscle fiber, when it contracts, as you can imagine, it's going to tug on the scleral spur, into which some of the trabecular meshwork beams are inserted. So some people believe that this acts like a valvular mechanism, meaning that every time the longitudinal muscle fiber contracts, you will have a tugging motion on the scleral spur, which will result in opening of the trabecular meshwork and less resistance and increased outflow pathway. Now, this is exactly how pilocarpine works in reducing the intraocular pressure. Either pilocarpine or accommodation, both of them, they reduce the outflow resistance, increase the outflow of aqueous, and reduce the intraocular pressure by its action on the longitudinal muscle fibers, which in turn tugs on the scleral spur. Important point for you to understand, and also from the exam point of view. Angle recession is a tear in the face of the ciliary body, right? When you have trauma, and the trauma leads to a tear in the face of the ciliary body, splitting between the longitudinal and the circular muscle fibers, that's what you call as angle recession. By the way, angle recession in itself does not cause glaucoma. The trauma that led to angle recession or split in the ciliary body phase, you have to assume is strong enough to cause adjacent collateral damage to the trabecular meshwork area also, and that is the reason why these patients will develop glaucoma as time goes on and the resultant scar tissue. So two important points that you have to remember here, okay? One is the location of the ciliary body in the angle, which is anterior to the root of the iris, and two, the ciliary body is made up of three types of muscles: longitudinal muscle fibers, which are attached to the scleral spur, is the source of contraction of the pilocarpine and accommodation, which leads to opening up of the trabecular meshwork, and that's how they reduce the intraocular pressure. And lastly, when people talk about angle recession, histopathologically, it is a split in the face of the ciliary body between the longitudinal and the circular muscle fibers. Now let's look at the scleral spur. It's the attachment point of the ciliary body to the sclera. Here is the scleral spur, here is the limbus, as you can see externally, and this is the scleral sulcus, and this is a knob-like anterior protrusion that you see. It's like a hook, if you like, of the sclera, and that portion of it is called as the scleral spur. The scleral spur is attached to the ciliary body muscle fibers attached to the scleral spur posteriorly, and the trabecular meshwork fibers, the beams, are attached to it anteriorly. So it's an important landmark for us to understand. It's also the principal site of disinsertion in cyclodialysis cleft formation. Remember, we just talked about angle recession, which is a tear in the face of the ciliary body, whereas in cyclodialysis cleft, the ciliary body, entire ciliary body, is disinserted from its attachment to the scleral spur. And consequently, what happens is too much fluid will flow, access the supraciliary space, and the pressure goes down. This is also the same path that some of these some of these newer surgical are actually not new, but the newly modified surgical procedures such as the supraciliary shunt procedures that people are talking about nowadays, they access this very space. So that the cyclodialysis procedures, okay? So it's important for you to understand where this is. Here is the ciliary body, here will be the scleral spur, and the potential space between the two, between the sclera and the ciliary body is the supraciliary space. So if you disinsert the ciliary body from the scleral spur, you can access the supraciliary space from the anterior chamber. And that's how this insertion of small tubes into this area, stents into this area will access the supraciliary space and control the pressure. Now let's talk about the trabecular meshwork itself. It's about 400 microns wide. It's the primary site of aqueous outflow pathway. Characteristically, it has a pigmented posterior section and a non-pigmented anterior zone. Aqueous flows only through the posterior region overlying the Schlemm's canal. Okay, so the three components like we talked about before, the innermost is the uveal portion, where the pore size is approximately 50 to 70 microns. The outer one is the corneoscleral portion, where the pore size is like 20 to 25 microns. And the outermost one, the junction of the corneoscleral portion of the trabecular meshwork and the Schlemm's canal, is what is called as the juxtacanaliculated area, which is supposed to be the site of resistance of aqueous outflow pathway. And then you have the Schlemm's canal. Now remember again, this is a question that is frequently asked. The juxtacanalicular tissue next to the Schlemm's canal is the principal site of resistance of the aqueous outflow pathway. Let's look at the Schlemm's canal itself. It's situated behind the posterior pigmented trabecular meshwork. It measures anywhere between 200 to 350 microns in width in enucleated fixated eyes. Aqueous courses into 25 to 30 afferent collector channels, which are all these little channels that are draining out of the Schlemm's canal, that drains the aqueous into the deeper scleral plexus and episcleral venous plexuses. The aqueous vein of Asher, here is one example of it, originates at the outer wall of the canal and terminates in the episcleral conjunctival veins. And these can be visualized clinically at the slit lamp. And you observe it carefully. You have these blood vessels, these vessels that are filled with clear fluid, which is aqueous, that joins the episcleral veins. And if you follow the path of this aqueous, you will see that for a certain distance, the aqueous and the blood have laminar flow side by side before the aqueous mixes with the blood and loses its clear color, and it becomes more red as it mixes with the blood itself. So these aqueous veins are discovered by Asher, and called as the Asher's aqueous veins. And again, like I mentioned, if you look at your limbal, perilimbal area carefully, you should be able to spot this Asher's vein. So again, to summarize this, you have a Schlemm's canal, which measures anywhere from 200 to 350 microns in width. And it's important to know that this is how it was found in enucleated eyes. And you have about 25 to 30 collector channels that drain the aqueous out of the Schlemm's canal into deeper scleral plexus and episcleral venous plexus. And the Schwalbe's line defines the anterior boundary of the canal, and it's right around this area here. It's seen as a knob-like convexity protruding into the anterior chamber. Histologically, it represents the termination of Descemet's membrane, and when it is prominent, it sticks out into the anterior chamber like a prominent white band, and that's called as a posterior embryotoxon. It's in most of these posterior embryotoxon, when you see it, it's not it's just a anatomical curiosity, but sometimes this posterior toxin is associated with some syndromes such as Axenfeld-Rieger syndrome that is associated with glaucoma. So anytime you see posterior toxin, make sure that you don't miss an underlying disease process such as the Axenfeld-Rieger syndrome, which can potentially lead to glaucoma. And also this Schwalbe's line is an important landmark when performing goniotomy. The internal incision is made just posterior to the Schwalbe's line. Here is the Schwalbe's line, and the incision is made somewhere in this area. So the Barton's membrane, when you do goniotomy, falls open, exposing the underlying trabecular meshwork tissues. Now let's look at the external anatomy. What is the limbus? The limbus is the transition zone between the cornea and the sclera. It measures 1.5 millimeters, like I mentioned previously. Note the conjunctival inserts more anteriorly at the superior, that's 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock position of the limbus. And so the limbus is wider at near the 12 superior and inferior regions compared to the nasal and the temporal regions. So most surgeons like to use the wider areas at the 12 o'clock position for surgical site. So here is the sclera, here is the cornea, the junction between the two is the limbus. The importance of the limbus is to know that the scleral spur, the scleral sulcus with the trabecular meshwork and the Schlemm's canal are located right underneath there. So there is an anterior limbus and a posterior limbus. The anterior boundary is the termination of the Bowman's membrane, and it's called as the corneal limbal junction. Okay, so the conjunctiva and the tenons cover the limbals all the way up to this point, and tenon's capsule is firmly attached to the underlying sclera about 1 millimeter posterior to the conjunctiva. As you can see, here is the scleral limbal junction. Here is the corneal limbal junction, okay, which is the anterior limbus, and here is the conjunctiva, here is the tenon's capsule, and you can see the location. This is the termination. Here is the Bowman's membrane ending right about here, and underneath the posterior, the scleral limbal junction is where you will find the Schlemm's canal. Now the posterior limbal junction is the opaque white scleral, the junction of the opaque white sclera posteriorly and the translucent bluish gray limbals anteriorly is called the posterior limbus. It's also called as the surgical limbus. Okay, so the transition zone between the sclera and the translucent area of transition into cornea is called as the surgical limbus, and it helps identify deeper structures with the angle. So the scleral spur is just posterior to this landmark. So here is the scleral limbal junction. It's a transition zone, like I mentioned, between the sclera and through the translucent bluish gray limbus anteriorly, and just posterior to this area is the scleral spur. Anterior to that is where the Schlemm's canal is. The reason why I'm spending so much time trying to explain this to you is it comes in handy when you start doing your glaucoma surgeries. And so I don't need to repeat this at that point in time. So spend enough time listening to this lecture and also study the anatomy every time you do your own surgery, and you understand where you're located. Clear understanding of the anatomy helps you make a better surgeon out of you. Also, understanding the anatomy gives you an understanding as to where the surgical interventions are likely to work. So let's move on to blood circulation. of the angle structures and of the ciliary process itself. So it's a dual circulation to the ciliary process. It's the posterior ciliary arteries and the anterior ciliary arteries, the two anastomos to form the major circle of iris. And from there, branches, the short radiating branches will form from this arterial circle, iris circle to form the ciliary process, capillaries. And the venous circulation is mostly via the vertex veins. The nasociliary branch from the ophthalmic division forms the long ciliary nerves which supply the iris, cornea, and the ciliary muscle. And so this entire complex is supplied by the nasociliary branch of the ophthalmic division, mainly from the long ciliary nerves. Let's look at the Schlemm's canal itself. It's described by Frederick Schlemm sometime in 1800s. He was a professor of anatomy in the University of Berlin. He also discovered the corneal nerves of the eye. This is a circular canal, measures 36 millimeters, is a single layer of endothelial cells. Its diameter varies from 190 to 350 microns in enucleated human eyes. It transports 2 to 3 microliters per minute of aqueous humor. Collector channel collects aqueous from the AC anterior chamber and delivers it into the venous blood supply. Let's look at the Schlemm's canal anatomically. One more time, here is the angle. This is a topographic view of how the angle structures are. Here is the iris. The trabecular meshwork is right about there, and you can see the Schlemm's canal, and here is where the ciliary processes are located. Here is the posterior chamber. Here is your lens. Here is the iris, and here is the pupillary margin right there. And so the aqueous that is produced here comes out through the pupillary margin into the anterior chamber, and from there exits out through the trabecular meshwork into the Schlemm's canal, and from the Schlemm's canal into the venous circulation. Here is a close-up view of the angle itself. You can see the root of the iris coming in here, and you can see the scleral spur right here. Here is the trabecular meshwork and the Schlemm's canal. Okay, and here is the electron microscopy picture borrowed from publications by Fredo. You know, this gentleman used to work in, I think, BU, and when I did my fellowship there, cornea fellowship, he was there, but I never realized that he did so much work on the electron microscopy of the angle structures. But here is how the aqueous outflow pathway is, and you can see it's going into the Schlemm's canal. And if you look at the electron microscopy pictures, here's the trabecular meshwork beams that we talked about. This with the pores in the spaces in between the beams, and here is the Schlemm's canal. And this is where the juxtacanalicular tissue is located. So the aqueous is cutting across the trabecular meshwork pores through the juxtacanalicular area into the Schlemm's canal. And from the Schlemm's canal, the aqueous is flowing out through the collector channels. What a wonderful picture. So it's this juxtacanalicular area and the inner wall endothelium of the Schlemm's canal complex, which is the primary site of aqueous resistance in patients, both in normal patients and in patients with glaucoma. Now let's look at the JCT, or the juxtacanalicular tissue, and the inner wall of the Schlemm's canal. When you look at the electron microscopy picture of this location, you will see that the area is studded with a lot of extracellular matrix. We'll talk briefly about this in a little while. And then you'll see a scattering of what empty spaces, what is considered as giant vacuoles. And here is the Schlemm's canal. So this is the Schlemm's canal, okay? And so the concept that people have is that aqueous will flow from the trabecular meshwork into this muddy area, if you like. And here, by a process of pinocytosis, it's believed that these giant vacuoles will start to engulf the aqueous humor and dump it across the inner wall of the Schlemm's canal into the canal itself, and from there it gets out into the collector channels. So pinocytosis appears to be an important part of transfer. There's some controversy whether pinocytosis is responsible for all of the transfer of aqueous humor into the Schlemm's canal or not. It's a debate that is still not resolved to the best of my knowledge, but enough for you to understand that the aqueous cuts across this juxtacanalicular extracellular matrix, and the presence of these giant vacuoles gives credibility to this concept of pinocytosis to transfer the aqueous across the inner endothelial lining of the Schlemm's canal into the Schlemm's canal. Now, this extracellular matrix is what buildup of this extracellular matrix in this area is what is supposed to increase the resistance in this area for the aqueous transfer across into the canal, and this is what is supposed to lead to the retention of aqueous, elevated intraocular pressure, and subsequently damage to the optic nerve, and that's what we call as glaucoma. This extracellular matrix is it's interesting analysis. There's a paper by Paul Pomberg and colleagues way back, I believe in 1980s, when he was still at WashU. An interesting paper where they compared they looked at this the content of this extracellular matrix, and they found that it's made of increase in glucosaminoglycans, especially the hyaluronic acid, contractyl sulfate, and heparin. And it's the accumulation of this matrix that causes the resistance to be increased. So this is a great area of research for those of you who are interested in solving the issue of glaucoma. Imagine if you can find a drug that can thin out this extracellular matrix, mostly the GAG materials, the glucosaminoglycans, the contractyl sulfate, the hyaluronic acid, and heparin from this area, that will decrease the resistance, and we won't have this pressure problem in the eye. So someone out there listening to my lecture hopefully will work on this. People have been working on it for a long time, but have not resulted in a product, a treatment modality at this point in time. So this is an area that is wide open for young researchers. This is a slide taken from my own work where we try to isolate the Schlemm's canal in living human beings. We took volunteers, mostly without glaucoma and some with glaucoma, and using this high-frequency ultrasound, 18 megahertz ultrasound, we were able to locate the Schlemm's canal. Here is a nice picture of the Schlemm's canal in relation to the angle structures. Here is the trabecular meshwork. Here is the iris, and here is the Schlemm's canal. And the diameter of the Schlemm's canal measured at approximately, I believe, 130 to 150 microns in living human beings. But I just mentioned previously that the published reports suggested the diameter of the canal to be anywhere from 200 to 350 microns. Now remember, this 150 microns that we measured 130 to 150 microns that we measured is in living human beings, and it may be that the canal is not completely dilated or distended to its full capacity while we are alive. And in a normal human being, there's no need for you to have a distended canal if there is a continuous flow of aqueous across it, right? And that may be the reason why the measurement that we have is much smaller than the measurements previously published from enucleated human eyes. Also, one of the variable is that when we place the ultrasound probe on the iris surface, on the scleral surface here, we don't know how much pressure is being exerted, leading to compression of and collapse of the canal. We had an experienced ultrasonographer do this while we were doing the study, and so we took as much care as we could to minimize that artifact from it. So there's another view of the Schlump's canal diagram in a cartoon version. As you can see, the aqueous going into the Schlump's canal, and from the Schlump's canal you have the collected channels, and the collected channels leads to the deep scleral and the episcleral venous system, plexus, and these are the aqueous veins of Asher that bypass the system and drain the aqueous straight into the episcleral venous plexus, which are visible for you to which are visible at the slit lamp. So next time you have you examine anyone, pay particular attention on high magnification, and looking out for these episcleral, these Asher's aqueous veins, and you will see clear aqueous fluid going through it. The resistance to aqueous outflow is supposed to be about 60 to 65% from the pre-canalicular tissue, that's the TM, trabecular meshwork, and the juxtacanalicular tissue, whereas up to 30 to 40% is supposed to be located in the post-canalicular pathways, 10 to 15% in the episcleral pathway, and another 25% in the deep scleral pathways. It's because of this, even when you bypass the trabecular and the juxtacanalicular resistance using such as devices such as the eye stent or the trabectome, where you strip the entire trabecular meshwork and open the canal straight into the anterior chamber, you still have the pressures don't go down below the episcleral venous pressure. And that's because there is still resistance beyond the canal. And so the maximum pressure reduction that you can expect is somewhere in the range of 15 to 30 to 15 to 16 millimeters of mercury. Important concept for you to understand. Now let's look at the ciliary body anatomy itself. As I mentioned before, the ciliary body is like a triangle in cut section, and so this portion is the one that's facing the angle. This is the portion that you'll see in the angle. The iris is iris root is inserted somewhere here. You have the sclera on top here. And so the space that is present in between the sclera and the ciliary body is called the supraciliary space. And the anterior portion is what we call as the pars plicata, which is rich with blood vessels and the muscle fibers. And this is where the iris ciliary processes take their origin from. Okay, and the posterior portion is what is called as pars plana. Remember, anatomically and surgically, that's located approximately 3 millimeters posterior to the limbus, is where we use to enter the vitreous. The retina surgeons always pass their MVR blade approximately 3 millimeters posterior to the limbus, and because you don't want to make the entry through the vascular rich pars plicata, which will result in vitreous hemorrhage. So the entry point is through pars plana, which is relatively avascular compared to pars plicata, and that's posterior portion of the ciliary body. Whereas the anterior portion is the pars plicata, and that's also the source of the ciliary processes. And this is the anterior face of the ciliary body, As I explained before to you, this is the portion that is visible to us when we look in the angle. Now, of course, the sclera comes forwards like this, and the scleral spur is right on top here, and it forms a recess. And so the rest of the angle structures are located in this. So I hope that clarifies. And of course, the cornea is located somewhere here, right? So the cornea goes in somewhere here. So this is how the angle structure is. That completes the entire angle in cut section. And so it's important for you to mentally conceive this picture of the angle yourself by drawing it, observing the pictures, redrawing it, and then go back when you're doing your surgery to reprocess this thought process so you know the angle anatomy clearly in your mind. Ciliary processes are nothing but villi, like the inward projections from the pars plicata, like I mentioned. Ciliary processes are long and slender in early life, but become more blunt in later life. And they measure approximately 2 millimeters long, 0.5 millimeters wide, and 1 millimeter in height. So each ciliary process, it's an interesting anatomy in itself. The capillaries is made up of a central capillary system. Where do you get these capillaries from? Like I mentioned previously in the previous slides, the long posterior ciliary arteries and the anterior ciliary arteries, they come together to contribute to the major arterial circle of the iris. From the major arterial circle of the iris, you get the short radial ciliary artery, which branches off into multiple capillaries, and these capillaries form the ciliary process. So each short radial ciliary artery has many branches, and this forms a rich network of capillaries within the ciliary process. So the capillaries in the ciliary process are kind of different from the rest of the capillaries that you see elsewhere in the body. These are multiple, and these are broad, meaning wide, and they have a lot of fenestrations in the wall, and they're surrounded by a loose connective tissue layer. Okay, so let me draw this again. If this is the process, this is the capillary, you have a layer of connective tissue surrounding this capillaries, and outside of this is a double layer of epithelium. So that's how this forms a ciliary process. Now, why do we need this kind of a complex anatomy here? It provides a large surface area, up to 6 square centimeters of capillaries, to be in contact with the epithelium, and this in turn will maximize the aqueous secretion into the small space called the posterior chamber. Now, the posterior chamber, as you know, is a very tiny place, and you need to have all of this aqueous being produced 24/7, and for that to happen, you need to have this rich network of capillaries. The capillaries need to have a continuous circulation of blood going through that, and that's the reason why these capillaries are kind of bigger than the regular size capillaries. And two, they have fenestrations to let the aqueous to seep out of the capillary walls into and then you have into the surrounding connective tissue. Then you have this double layer of epithelium that will then modify the plasma that's coming out to form the aqueous as we know it before it's secreted into the posterior chamber. Here is an example of how the ciliary process looks. This is in a 60-year-old, and as you can see, is short and blunt, looking not like the ones that we have. I do have pictures of babies with the ciliary processes. I should include those in the next lecture. But as you can see, this particular patient is undergoing endocyclophotocoagulation, and during the process is when this picture was taken, but gives you an idea as to how the ciliary process looks like. Now let's look at the anatomy of the ciliary process one more time in greater detail in this cartoon version. Here is the capillary, okay? Here is the capillary, and there is a layer of loose connective tissue, and this is surrounded by a basement membrane. Now remember, this basement membrane that we're talking about here is a continuation of the Brooks membrane that separates out the choroidal blood vessels from the retina. So this basement membrane that you find here is the anterior extension of the Brooks membrane, and this is followed by the pigmented epithelium, which is the anterior extension of the retinal pigment epithelium itself. And you'll see a lot of melanocytes in this pigmented epithelium. And then the innermost layer, the non-pigmented epithelium, where you see this intermediary size mitochondria. So these cells are rich in this mitochondria, and endoplasmic reticulum too. They're very prominent in these cells, and obviously they have a role in this active secretion. And this is supposed to be the site of active secretion of aqueous humor. Remember this, it's the inner non-pigmented epithelium that is the active site of aqueous humor production. And then you have the internal limiting membrane. This internal limiting membrane, and here is the posterior chamber. Okay, the posterior chamber is somewhere here. So this internal limiting membrane here is the continuation of the internal limiting membrane of the retina, except it's a little modified. It's thicker for one thing, and one of the functions of this internal limiting membrane is to be attached to the zonules. Remember, the zonules from the lens or attached to the ciliary process. It's actually attached to this internal limiting membrane of the ciliary process. To support the lens, I would imagine you need to have a thicker internal limiting membrane. Otherwise, if it's too thin and flimsy, it can peel off. I mean, that's easy enough for us to understand. So this internal limiting membrane is a little thicker compared to, and sturdier compared to the internal limiting membrane on top of the retina. Now, look at these cells. The non-pigmented and the pigmented epithelial cells are tightly bound. There is no space between them, side to side and also across. And this junction, this complex of pigmented and non-pigmented epithelium with the internal limiting membrane and the basement membrane is what is supposed to be responsible for the blood-aqueous barrier. There is not one particular membrane here that is considered to be responsible for blood-aqueous barrier. Rather, this entire complex is what is supposed to be responsible for the blood-aqueous barrier. Why is that important? Because aqueous, remember, has to be optically clear. And for that to happen, you have to filter out certain proteins and big cells, etc., from the aqueous humor. Otherwise, light cannot pass through, right? And to keep that optically clear aqueous the way it should be, you need this blood-aqueous barrier. And this barrier, again, I repeat, is provided by this complex of basement membrane, the pigmented epithelium, the non-pigmented epithelium, and the internal limiting membrane. All of them put together forms this complex. Now, individually, what's going to happen here, and we will go through this a little later in the lecture, is that the capillaries, briefly speaking, will let the plasma come out into this stroma by, say, ultrafiltration, and from there the plasma is going to leak across the cells, the pigmented and the non-pigmented cells. And it's assumed that within the non-pigmented cells, the active presence of mitochondria and the endoplasmic reticulum indicates that there's some active addition and subtraction of molecules that are taking place here, following which there is active secretion of aqueous, or it could be just diffusion of aqueous into the posterior chamber. So there's the assumption is that there's ultrafiltration from the capillaries into the stroma and the epithelial cells. There's some active secretion going on of sodium, potassium, and ascorbate and other structures, bicarbonate, in the non-pigmented epithelium. And from there, the aqueous is either actively secreted across by the use of sodium potassium pump and the bicarbonate pump, or some of it is by passive diffusion into the postage chamber. And we'll talk a little bit more about what these different mechanisms of aqueous production mean. So to summarize so far, aqueous humor is formed by ciliary process. There are about 80 ciliary processes made of branches from major arterial circle of iris. Remember this. Outer pigmented and the inner non-pigmented epithelium put together form the blood aqueous barrier. The inner non-pigmented epithelium is a source of aqueous production and active filtration, active secretion of aqueous. Remember this. This is also an OCAP question. Now, why do we need aqueous at all? That's the other important question that you need to ask yourself. What is the function of what is the role of aqueous in the human eye? The aqueous humor provides nutrition to the lens and the inner portion of the cornea. That's number one function. Two, once it provides nutrition, it has to take away the waste products. So it takes away the waste products. Three, by maintaining an optically empty quality, it is helping to get the light across to the retina, and that way we can actually see. So the optical quality of the aqueous humor is also important, right? And so those are the three major functions. And then, of course, the fourth major function is to maintain the pressure in the eye, so as to maintain the shape of the eyeball. And as you know, if you see a patient with hypotony, the patient is not going to see well. So the aqueous, the other important function of aqueous humor is to maintain the intraocular pressure of the eye. That is to keep the anatomy intact, to let the eye process the vision. Let's go through how aqueous humor is formed and secreted. So there are three modes of secretion, like I mentioned before. Active secretion, 2 is ultrafiltration, and 3 is diffusion. Active secretion is an energy-dependent secretion. It is intraocular pressure independent mechanism. It involves probably two enzyme systems, sodium potassium ATPase system to transport sodium potassium, and the carbonic anhydrase activity system, which is not very well understood at the present time. It accounts for most of the aqueous production. And so sodium, potassium ascorbate, and bicarbonate are actively transported from plasma to postage chamber with water and chloride following passively. I will summarize how this all works once I go through the different mechanisms and as to how we know that there is active secretion in the human eye. Let's go through the terminology first. Ultrafiltration is a passive technique. Ultrafiltration is slightly different from dialysis. Most of you are familiar with the concept of dialysis, right? What is it? If you have a membrane that separates out on one side protein and salt from water, and the membrane is permeable only to salt and water, but not to protein, what will happen is that the salt moves towards water while water moves towards protein by diffusion. When this process is accelerated by hydrostatic pressure on the protein side, such as is seen in the capillaries, then you call this process as ultrafiltration. The ultrafiltration occurs across capillary walls due to higher pressure and higher protein concentration in plasma as compared with the extracellular space. So this is fairly easy to understand. You put a protein plus salt, and you have a membrane across, and you have water here. What's going to happen is that, and this membrane, let's assume, is permissible only to salt and water, in which case you have salt moving this way, and you have water moving this way, to the extent that the salt and the water content on either side equilibrate. Till such time you have these pathways going back and forth, right? And because the protein cannot move out of this membrane, protein will stay on this side. And this is how dialysis works. And if you notice the different dialysis units that are there in patients with kidney failure, either the artificial kidney dialysis or the peritoneal dialysis, they use this exact same concept. They retain the protein, but the toxic salt or higher concentration of salt goes across the membrane, and in return, water, clean water, will get into get through the membrane towards the protein site. Now you add high pressure to this, which is what the capillary pressure is higher, the hydrostatic pressure. Then it forces this process to happen a little bit more faster, and this is what we call as ultrafiltration. And diffusion again is a passive technique, and it accounts for the passive movement of ions across a membrane related to charge and concentration. So the molecules in the fluid medium are in constant random motion, and the various things like temperature, viscosity, and permeability of the membrane all can affect the rate, and they smoke all they want, and you have non-smokers in this portion of the room. At some point, all the smoke from here is going to cut across the room into this portion, and the clean air in this area will go towards the area where the smoking is occurring, right? This is a simple example of diffusion, and this process is going to go on till there is equilibrium of the content of the smoke molecules across the room is about the same in both corners. So this is a random diffusion that happens, and this accounts for some of the salt, some of the ions moving across the membrane, so as to keep the charge between membranes, between both sides, to be the same. So let me see if I have a slide to explain that. Okay, so here let's summarize the three ways of aqueous production: the active secretion, the ultrafiltration, and passive or diffusion, right? And so, like I mentioned at the very beginning of my conversation, how do we know? How do we know, first of all, that there is active secretion going on in the human eye? So there is a phenomena wherein, like I mentioned in that ultrafiltration technique, you have salt going across the membrane. You have this membrane, which is the epithelial membrane there, okay, the ciliary process, and within the capillaries of the ciliary process, you have protein, okay, you have protein and salt, and you have clear liquid on the other side, that's plasma, water. Let's put that as water. So so the salt is going to cut across to equate. So sodium and potassium are going to go out, and that's positively charged. And then the negative charge has to come out, which is the chloride, right? And so the positive and the negative charge has to always be in balance on both sides of the membrane. Okay, so that's how this diffusion or ultrafiltration will occur. This basic science philosophy that we all understand. So the net charge on either side of the membrane has to remain constant. But in aqueous, in the ciliary, if you analyze the aqueous humor and you analyze the plasma content of the blood, then you realize that there are some composition of the aqueous which is higher in the aqueous compared to plasma. Now, question is, how did you get this? And that's where the active secretion concept came into existence. And that's the only way you can explain that there is active secretion, the only way to explain away as to why the concentration of certain things like ascorbic acid, ascorbate, and is higher in the plasma, higher in the aqueous compared to plasma, right? And that's where the concept of active secretion came into play, just so you know. So the greatest difference between aqueous and plasma is very low protein concentration in aqueous. Also remember there's high concentration of ascorbate and lactate in the aqueous compared to plasma. Glucose, urea, non-protein, nitrogen are slightly less than in plasma, and also the concentration of various ions and composition of the aqueous varies between posterior chamber and the anterior chamber of the aqueous, simply because so aqueous is in the posterior chamber, it's giving off nutrition to the lens. Okay, here it's giving off nutrition to the lens, picking up waste products from the lens, and from there, as it escapes into the anterior chamber, it has a little bit more waste product and a little less nutrition, one would assume, because of what the donations that it has made and the collections that it made from the lens. And within the anterior chamber, it has to supply nutrition to cornea and pick up the waste product from the corneal endothelial cells before it exits out of the eye. So there is a constant change in the aqueous composition depending upon where you measure the aqueous composition, posterior chamber versus anterior chamber. Important concept for you to understand. And so is also there is a difference in the PO2 level in the posterior chamber of the aqueous versus the anterior chamber of the aqueous. We are in fact in the middle of conducting some experiments to show how a variation of the PO2 can cause alteration of the corneal endothelial cell function. It's becoming more and more clear that majority of the PO2 oxygen content of the aqueous is coming from the cornea, from the atmosphere cutting across the cornea into the AC. And so if this is true, it's easy for you to understand that the PO2 concentration is low in the posterior chamber compared to anterior chamber, because the posterior chamber is far away from the cornea compared to the anterior chamber aqueous, right? Another concept for you to think about. And so how does this aqueous circulate in the eye? It's being produced here by the ciliary process in the posterior chamber. From the ciliary process, by a combination of active secretion, ultrafiltration, and diffusion, aqueous is pumped into the posterior chamber. From the posterior chamber, aqueous is going to bathe the lens, supplies nutrition to the lens, and through the pupillary margin, it's going into the anterior chamber. And when it's in the anterior chamber, its circulation is affected by a couple of things. One is the mechanical, meaning the position of the head and the position of the human body and the movement of the head and movements of the eye, etc. Right? The other thing and the pressure gradient difference between the posterior chamber and the anterior chamber. And the third thing that affects the circulation of the aqueous in the anterior chamber is what is called as the thermal circulation. There is blood flowing in the iris, which means that the iris has a higher temperature, whereas the corneal endothelium here, the inner portion of the cornea, has no blood, which means that it's cooler. So you have warm iris right here and cold cornea right here. And when you have a fluid such as the aqueous circulating, come in contact with the warmer surface, which is the iris surface, it's going to warm here, get warm, and warm liquid, what does it do? It raises up. So it goes in touch with the cornea, and the cold cornea cools it down, and then the cold liquid tends to go down, which is where this thermal circulation goes continuous. So the aqueous that's coming out from the pupillary margin is going to become cold, comes down, gets warm, goes up. So this is And how do you know you can this thing actually exists? If you notice any particles, pigment coming from the posterior chamber into the anterior chamber, or you inject something like catalog into the posterior chamber and you see the way the catalog comes out into the anterior chamber, or if you see a patient with keratic precipitates, cells, white cells depositing on the cornea, or pigment dispersion syndrome patient where the pigment is released from the iris, because of the constant rubbing motion of the iris against the zonules. In any one of these examples, you can actually watch the pigment traveling in a circular fashion like this, and in the process, it's going to come in contact with the center portion of the cornea, giving rise to a deposit of corneal deposits in the center, the spindle-shaped deposit that you see of the pigment in pigment dispersion syndrome, or in acute iridocyclitis, where you see most of the keratic precipitates in the central lower half of the cornea. Interesting, huh? So there are a couple of enzyme systems that help us in active secretion of aqueous. The beta-2 receptors are the most prevalent adrenergic receptors in the ciliary epithelium, and they're supposed to help us in the sodium-potassium ATPase pump system mechanism. And this is important because we block the beta receptors by using beta blockers such as timolol. There is a 30–40% reduction of the aqueous. And then you have the carbonic anhydrase enzyme system that helps in actively secreting bicarbonate ion. And as you know, the carbonic anhydrase inhibitors will also decrease aqueous production. So here are some facts for you to remember. Anterior chamber volume is 0.25 milliliters. The posterior chamber volume is 0.06 milliliters. Rate of aqueous humor formation is 2 microliters per minute. 3% of the posterior chamber volume and 1% of the anterior chamber volume is replaced per minute. The aqueous production varies diurnally and drops during sleep. The primary resistance to the outflow occurs at the juxtacanalicular tissue. Aqueous leaves the eye via trabecular meshwork by bulk flow. UVS scleral outflow. We'll have a lecture in the near future specifically about the UV scleral outflow pathways and the trabecular meshwork pathway. And so I briefly wanted to touch base on this so as to complete this portion of the lecture. Accounts for 20% of the aqueous outflow and is a pressure-dependent pathway. It's increased by cycloplegic agents, epinephrine, apracronidine, bromonidine or alpha-GAN, latanoprose or prostaglandin analogs, and cyclodialysis, and decreased by miotics. Important things for you to remember, both from your exams and practical point of view for the treatment of patients with glaucoma. Let's move on to the intraocular pressure briefly, and there will be an entire lecture devoted to this in the near future. But I want to, to complete this aqueous production lecture, I got to mention a little bit about the aqueous and the intraocular pressure, contribution of the aqueous humor towards the intraocular pressure dynamics. The Goldman equation states the P is equal to F by C plus PV, as we all know. P0 here is intraocular pressure in millimeters of mercury. F is the rate of aqueous humor formation in microliters per minute. PV is the episcleral venous pressure in millimeters of mercury. C is the facility of outflow in microliters per minute in millimeters of mercury. And usually the number that is thrown out for C, the facility of outflow is 0.22 to 0.28 microliters per minute per millimeter of mercury. And R is the resistance to the outflow, is inversely related to the facility of outflow. As you can imagine, resistance is inversely related to the facility of the outflow. It's important for you to understand this, this equation, for you to understand how the resistance is. There is a whole chapter dedicated to this in Chandler Grant's new glaucoma textbook that I highly recommend, edited by Malik Kahook and Joel Schumann. It's a great book that came out, I believe, last year. You can see that when the resistance is elevated, the coefficient the C decreases and leads to increase in intraocular pressure, and they go on to give you examples of how this can be calculated. The episcleral venous pressure, which is normally about 10 to 12 millimeters of mercury, plus F by C, going back here. F is the rate of aqueous humor formation, and C is the facility of outflow, will give you the intraocular pressure. The episcleral venous pressure being constant in most patients unless they have a disease process, measured say about 9 or 10 millimeters of mercury, and the rate of aqueous humor formation 1.5 microliters per minute divided by C, the factor of 0.22 gives you a pressure of 15. In patients with open angle glaucoma where the resistance is increased and so is C is decreased, let's say to 0.1, you will have pressures at 24. In patients with advanced open angle glaucoma, the resistance is even more higher and C is decreased to 0.05, and that can give you a pressure of 48 using the Goldman equation. Sometimes they do ask you to calculate this out in your board exams, so pay attention to this. Episcleral venous pressure, like I mentioned just now, is typically measures 8 to 12 millimeters of mercury. It's increased in patients with the CC fistula, such as this particular patient who ended up with a motor vehicle accident, and you can see the episcleral veins are standing out against the white conjunctiva. That's pretty classic for patients with this kind of disease process. And if you do a gonioscopy, you will see blood in the Schlemm's canal. The pressure is usually elevated, and it's an indication. If you put a stethoscope on this eye, you can hear the bruit of the CC fistula. In acute conditions, the IOP raises 1 millimeter for 1 millimeter increase in the episcleral venous pressure. In chronic conditions, this may vary. And quickly, intraocular pressure normally measures approximately 16 millimeters of mercury plus or minus 3. It's a non-Gaussian distribution with a skew towards higher pressure, especially in over 40s. It's decreased by alcohol and cannabis, increased by caffeine, recombinant posture, age, and first order relatives. There is a diurnal variation of the intraocular pressure, like I mentioned, based on the diurnal variation of the aqueous production. This variation can vary between 2 and 6 millimeters of mercury. Greater than 10 millimeters of mercury in the diurnal variation is suggestive of glaucoma. Peak pressures are typically in the morning. The principal technique that is used to measure the intraocular pressure across the world for the last 50 years has been the Goldman application tonometry, which is based on the invert fit principle of pressure in a cylinder is equal to force applied to flatten a known surface area of the cylinder. The Goldman pressure prism measures 3.06 millimeters. Remember this is a important OCAP question for you guys to remember. At this prism diameter, the corneal resistance equals the capillary attraction of the tear film versus the meniscus. And that's the reason why he came out with this particular diameter. Intraocular pressure in millimeters equals to the flattening force in grams multiplied by 10. And that's the reason why this technique is so simple and has become so popular in use. The split image prism allows for greater accuracy of image measurement. Here is a picture of the great man Goldman himself here. He's from Germany. His story goes that he produced this technology and left it in his drawer for 6 months before the company guys came knocking on his door, and he said, by the way, I know how to measure accurately the pressure in the eye and produce this little device. But of course we know now that this is not as accurate as we thought, because one piece of the knowledge that Goldman lacked in those days was that the cornea thickness is not uniform in every human being. We do now know using the ultrasound technology that cornea thickness varies from one person to another person. And so if you have thin corneas or thick corneas, the Goldman equation is thrown, is not accurate. And we'll have a separate talk on this. And there are other ways of measuring the cornea in intraocular pressure. And like I just mentioned, we'll have a separate conversation on this. Now, I conclude this lecture by pointing out the importance of knowing the anatomy and physiology of any disease process. So you can plan interventions based on the anatomy and physiology. So here you have the trabecular meshwork and the juxtaclavicular area, which is the source of the outflow pathway resistance. And you can bypass that by any of the surgical modes of iStent, trabectome, or canaloplasty, right? You can tug on the scleral spur. Actually, let me go back a little bit here. The aqueous production site, which is the ciliary processes, active secretion, like I pointed out, is through the beta receptors and the carbonic anhydrase enzyme systems, and by blocking those, you can have aqueous production reduction, and that's exactly what the beta blockers and the CIA inhibitors do, and that's how they control the intraocular pressure. If you come to the level of the trabecular meshwork itself, you can see I mentioned the scleral spur and the fact that the longitudinal muscle fibers of the ciliary body is attached to the scleral spur, and the trabecular meshwork is also attached to the scleral spur. So when you contract the the longitudinal muscle fibers of the ciliary body, which is what pilocarpine does, then you can open up the trabecular meshwork and increase the aqueous outflow and decrease the intraocular pressure. Now, within the trabecular meshwork itself, remember I mentioned in the anatomy the beams, the trabeculum itself. So the cytoskeletal skeletal structure of the trabecular meshwork itself can be modified to decrease the resistance and increase outflow, and that has led to the new system of glaucoma pressure reduction called the rheokinase enzyme inhibitors, which are undergoing FDA trials as we speak. And a lot of this concept came from Dave Epstein, great man who just recently passed away, but his contributions to glaucoma cannot be underestimated. He's a great mentor, trained a lot of people, great researcher, conceived this idea of working on the rheokinase, this trabecular skeletal muscle, the skeleton of the trabecular meshwork alteration, which has eventually led to these rheokinase enzyme inhibitors. We miss researchers, clinician scientists such as Dave Epstein. And lastly, bypassing the trabecular meshwork into the Schlemm's canal is where the surgical techniques of iStent and trabectome and canaloplasty come into play. So there's still a lot of scope for researchers, young researchers who are listening to this lecture, to modify any one of these locations so as to control the intraocular pressure, either by decreasing the production of the aqueous or increasing the outflow pathway. You can modify this and control the intraocular pressure, and thus save a lot of people from going blind. So that completes the lecture. I want to thank all of you for patiently listening to this lecture on aqueous humor formation and anatomy, relevant anatomy. So please look out for more lectures on MediTread YouTube website related to this and other ophthalmology related lecture series that we will be putting out. And also please look out for our CME and board review courses that we will send out as advertisements. If you have any questions or comments, you can either post it on our YouTube site or send your comments directly to me at ayala@meditread.com. Again, thank you, and I'll see you all next week with the third lecture in the series. Thank you.